Well, thank you again for joining us on our celebration today. We've recently, in the last few years, begun to celebrate Black History Month, and also in the fall we do a Hispanic Heritage Month. In June we do LGBT Pride. Anybody else that feels uncelebrated, come talk to me. We really do want to lift up everyone and just recognize that we are all lifted up when we lift up groups. I'll say more about that in a moment. I'm really honored to be able to bring the message today, too, and it will be short because we have more great music coming up. But I do want to share with you that Dr. Martin Luther King is probably my greatest spiritual hero and exemplar of what it looks like when someone lives their spiritual principles. He absolutely did that. And the message title that I've chosen is from his final speech, the night before he was assassinated. He was speaking in Memphis, and it's now called the Up to the Mountaintop speech. There are three things I noticed when I reread the text of that message that he gave that night. And the first is that he called out injustice. He recognized that something wasn't right in the world, and he spoke about it powerfully. What you may or may not know is that Dr. King was a student of Gandhi. And Gandhi formulated the ability or the path of nonviolent resistance, a way of bringing change into the world. And we use the word nonviolent, but that's not exactly the right word. In Sanskrit, which is the sacred language of Hinduism and Buddhism, there is a word that we don't have the equivalent for in English, and that word is called ahimsa. And the closest we can get is by putting a negative in there and saying it's nonviolence. But it's not the same as peace, and it's not the same as stillness. It is the idea of bringing strength and power and spiritual principle into the world, but not being against nobody. Being for the right. And that's what Dr. King brought. And so he taught people how to stand up for equality and justice. And when violence was visited upon those of his that followed Dr. King, he taught them not to resist, to not respond in kind. Because he knew that once violence was met with violence, the cause was lost. And he never did. And so he was able, in that final speech, there was a problem with the sanitation workers there in Memphis were not being treated fairly. And so he was calling out for action, but that was not against, that was for equality and justice. The second thing I noticed in that speech is that he spoke his vision. And I think the most eloquent iteration of that we've all heard is his I Have a Dream speech from the March on Washington that he gave with tens of thousands of people gathered there on the lawn. And he spoke about his dream of this nation, our nation, living in equality, where children of color would walk hand in hand with white children. And he spoke this dream with power and with conviction. And so the final part of his speech on that night in Memphis, it's really, it's remarkable. Paulette and I were talking about it. There was something different about him. And these are actually his words. I want to read them to you. He had already been visited with death threats and had been assassination attempts. He had been stabbed. He knew that his life was in danger all of the time he did his work. I don't know if he knew that this would be his final night in this body. But this is what he said. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. And I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I'm amazed at his ability to stand in truth and to speak that truth. And knowing that his own life was in danger, he still spoke a positive vision. He said, there is a promised land. And when he said we as a people, he did not just mean black folks. He meant we will get to a place of justice and equality, of love for all. And he saw it, and he spoke it. I'm in a bit of a quandary giving a message today on Dr. King and this idea of social justice or elevating, those who are disenfranchised in any way. Because here's the deal. In Unity, it is a very personal teaching and a path. The 5 principles, which we did the sermon series on last month, it's all about personal transformation, taking personal responsibility, applying these principles of spiritual transformation to ourselves. And so I thought, how do I, as a Unity minister, stand and talk about responsibility for the we, when our teaching is really about the I? And I went into prayer about it, and I was in deep conversation inside about how do we do this? How can we stand in absolute alignment with Unity principle and be in alignment with this thing that we know something is happening in the world that is calling for our attention? And I really went to Dr. King. He is my spiritual hero. And I thought, I'm sure that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had opportunities to have a nice, cushy, safe life. Gifted man, intelligent man. He had opportunities to carve out some place in our nation where he could have had a professorship or maybe a dean of a university or have a nice big church with a beautiful, place to live for he and his children. He could have had something that was for him. And yet he looked around and he saw that he could apply his gifts to help the whole. And what I've come to really understand is that, yes, when we come into Unity, often we are in need of healing our own lives. And, as they say on the airplane, put the mask over your own face first. Because if you are not you can't give from an empty cup. You have to attend to yourself and your own healing. And so if your financial life is broken, then use these principles to get in integrity with money. And if your relationships aren't right, go to Charles' workshop. I think he's going to fix you today. But just, you have to take care of yourself. I'm not saying that we don't. We must. But at some point, my brothers and sisters, we have to be healed enough to offer a gift back into the world to help others. Amen? So Dr. King saw something that was asking for his attention, and he said yes. He was a great scholar of the Bible, as you probably know, and when he talked about going up to the mountain, he's talking about somebody else's story. You know who that is? It was Moses. He was making a reference to another story of a leader of a people who knew there was a promised land. And if you remember in that story, Moses also didn't enter into the promised land. He stood on the mountain and he saw it. And if you think back in that story, if you don't know the Bible stories, I grew up in Sunday school, so I know these stories quite well. Moses was given up by his birth family and adopted into the royal family of Egypt. And so and I also would like to say, when we do one of these stories from the Bible, I don't know if any of this happened, but I know it's true. There's great truth in these stories for us today. But the people of his birth, the Hebrew nation, they were enslaved in Egypt. And yet Moses was of the royal family. And one day, the story tells us that he saw a slave master beating one of the Hebrew children. He saw something, and he couldn't abide it. Now, he did not have Dr. King or Gandhi's teachings on nonviolence, so the story says that Moses killed the slave master. His anger, his rage at this injustice was so high. But Moses was transformed. And he saw that he was needed. He resisted. There's Dr. Sheila McKeithen, who spoke at the Big Sky Retreat last year. I heard her speak one time at Revelations, Michael Beckwith's conference, and she said there are two kinds of calls. There's the David call and there's the Moses call. The David call is, you are anointed to be the king of Israel. You get it all right spelled out for you. The Moses call is, Moses, go down to Egypt and talk to Pharaoh for me, would you? Moses resisted, and every step he just said, well, okay, I'll do that. And then the next step was revealed. And the next, and the next. Most of us, I believe, are like Moses. We see something needs to be changed. And I may not have much to give, but I'll give what I can in obedience to the call. How many of you have seen the new movie, Hidden Figures? Quite a few. It's nominated for several Oscars tonight. It's an incredible story. It's a story of three women who worked for NASA in the 1960s. I want to get these names right, so I want to make sure I get this. Taraji P. Henson plays Katherine Johnson. She's a mathematician who calculated flight trajectories for Project Mercury and other missions. There's also Octavia Spencer as Dorothy Vaughan and Janelle Monáe as Mary Jackson. Kevin Costner plays the director of the rocket program, Al Harrison. It's an amazing, amazing story. And especially it centers around Katherine Johnson, just a gifted mathematician. And she didn't have the opportunities that many people did, but she was educated, and her gifts were recognized. The rocket team, they needed a computer. This is when computers were still people. And they needed a computer, so they got her in there. She was the only woman and the only non-white person in this room. And she was figuring it out. It's a beautiful story. But the space race was quite intense. The Russians had already put a man in orbit, and there was a lot of pressure that America get caught up in this game, and they needed to get an astronaut up in space. And so they were pushing people really hard to work on the numbers, get it right, figure it out. And the director of the program, Al Harrison, he noticed that Katherine Johnson was absent from her desk for a lot of the day. And it didn't sit too well with him. Doesn't she realize we need her here working? And so he confronted her in the movie, and again, I don't know if it happened that way, but Hollywood was beautiful at telling the story. He said, where are you all these times during the day? We need you here. And she said, sir, I have to go to the bathroom. And he said, you're gone long stretches of time. She said, sir, there is no bathroom for me in this building. And he's confused. He says, what? Surely there are restrooms here in our building. And then he sees it. He sees it. The color of her skin will not allow her to use the women's restroom in that building. And she has to walk all the way across campus to use the restroom for colored women. And he has a moment where, up until then, the disadvantages of black women were not of concern or of notice to him. And then it affected him in some way, and he saw it. And I was reminded, I didn't tell this part of the story in the first service, but he took action, a little bit violent on that restroom sign. Took a sledgehammer and took down the sign. Stood for something. He saw that change was needed and stepped into action for equality. And that's what we're about. So my story with this is not nearly as dramatic, but about 10 years ago, I was in seminary, and I took a class on diversity, and our friend Tracy Brown, who has taught and spoken here at Unity, she was teaching the class, and she is an African-American woman and a diversity expert and a beautiful teacher. And she was explaining that here's something you may not know. She said, if I want to buy my mother a Mother's Day card, I can't buy one that has an image of a black face in any stores except in certain neighborhoods. I have to go to another part of town to buy a Mother's Day card from where I live. I didn't know. Never thought about it. It didn't enter into my awareness. So in Unity, we are really good at two things. We're really good at knowing that we're all the same, we're all children of God, and we're really good at knowing that we're all unique, we're all different. But there is a middle place where some groups have a different experience of life on earth than others, and we're a little uncomfortable. We're new to this game. But we're learning. and I'm learning. And I want to know, and I want us all to begin to look around and see what's happening in our world. I'm not asking us to, we are living in a very polarized time. Our politics are very polarized. Howard put a thing on Facebook recently, and there was some polarization that happened in the comments section. Some of you may have been on there, but I noticed that members of our church were very oppositional to each other in the comment section of Howard's post. I'm glad he posted it, not me. No, I'm just kidding. But I get that it's so easy to get into opposition. But what is our name, church? And so our calling is to not oppose and not get on the other camp, but to try and see what might be happening from the other perspective. Cindy has been so beautiful about posting all perspectives of what is happening in our country now so we can see what other people are feeling and thinking. Instead of trying to prove somebody wrong and convince someone that they need to change their position to be where we are, we need to see unity and be for something and against nothing. I'm not giving this message to make anybody feel guilty, so if you feel guilty, I'm going to let you deal with that yourself. That's not my aim. I am trying to get us to become aware and see we are unity. There's a great temptation to go into us and them. There's no them. Do you hear me? There is no them. There may be members of your own family who voted differently than you. Your family gatherings may be a little tense right now. There is no them. We are all in this together. And if other people are not seeing it, then that makes our job all the more important. That we stand as the place, recognizing there is one life, one presence, one power, revealing itself as one human race. I feel like we're on the precipice of doing great work in this church around healing the heart of America. If you're willing to see God revealed as humanity, please join us. God bless you.